Does the 30% rule apply on medication? No, because in 55 to 65% of the cases of children, the medication will normalize them. So that's over a half, and in some cases 2/3. The 30% is gone, only when the medication is active. So at the end of the day, here it comes, and by 8 o'clock at night, you're back to 30% again. So just keep in mind that it can normalize some children. In the remaining 30%, the gap is closed, but not completely. There is improvement, but not normalization. Other things will have to be done to help with that gap. And then there's about 10 to 15% of the kids who don't respond to any particular agent. And in that case, you're just going to have to deal with the full 30% and accommodate it as best you can.
Thank you.
So, good question. Well, I don't know that there's one best way because, let's face it, there are some neighbors or some parents of other friends who aren't going to respond to anything. And they don't want your kid around. And it's best that your child find another set of friends or stay away from that home. They don't need to be hearing that stuff. But most parents are fairly reasonable people. And I think if you went to them, if you downloaded a fact sheet on ADHD from my website or the CHAD website, and you just took it to them, this sort of 2 to 3 page description, or you called them and said, I've been meaning to come by or have you over for a coffee, or as part of this little social coffee clutch or whatever, you introduce this information about your child, about their diagnosis, about what it is, and the various things that you all are trying to do to contend with it. I think you might find these people being more compassionate than they ordinarily would. They're probably laboring under a lot of misimpressions that the public has anyway, that your child could be better, this is your fault, it's a result of parenting. And we sort of need to disabuse them of those ideas. But I like the honesty as the best policy approach to begin with. Now, obviously, if in the middle of this conversation it becomes very clear that these parents don't care, don't understand, and don't want to, then you should not be allowing your child to play at their home or under their supervision. Feel free to invite their child over to your house if they'll allow it, but I still think informing the public. We've had some teenagers carry around a card about ADHD in their wallet so that they can show it to people who are not familiar with ADHD, a coach or a policeman that pulls them over for speeding or, something like that. But very much like we got the idea from the Tourette Syndrome Foundation, which publishes small cards that are information that allow Tourette's people to share the information without necessarily having to explain it all themselves. But here's a sheet from a reputable source like CHAD or my website that they can learn from. The most you can do is to try to persuade them, inform them, maybe change their mind. And then the rest is shopping for more reasonable friends and parents of friends if you can. Now, some people ask, well, my child doesn't have an awful lot of friends. What can I do to try to improve that? Make your house the best place to play on the street. It's bribery, but I don't care how you do it. Yeah, you need to have the best toys in the yard. You need to have the best games in the house. You need to be somebody who feeds all visitors so that when anybody shows up, man, there's a fudgesicle in your hand and an Oreo and a glass of milk and here's the Wii system. And I mean, you are just going to create this place where they love being there, whether your son is there or not, right? And hopefully some of these friendships will stick or take, or they'll be a little more forgiving of your child's immaturities because you're such a great place to be. However you can arrange this environment, you can't make other children like your child. That is not possible to do. You can only make them more likable or make the environment in which your child exists more likable. And hopefully some of that sticks. So approach it that way, but you can't make another child want to play with your child. It's just not going to happen. Those children make their own choices. There are a number of treatments on the market right now that are based on these neuropsychological theories of ADHD as an executive disorder, particularly that involves working memory. Torgil Klingberg is the developer of CogMed. He's a Swedish scientist. CogMed is working memory training. It's practicing digit span forward and backward and spatial memory forward and backward for about 45 minutes a day with your child. You do need to reward them because this gets boring to tears after the first day or two. So you have to have a token system and a reward program in place. Program costs several $1,000s. Now, I have visited Sweden and his lab. I've gone over their data. And it does look like this produces a temporary improvement in working memory, and that results in a temporary decrease in ADHD symptoms. But even Klingberg has shown that with 3 months of training or up to 6 months of training, the effect might last maybe 3 months. And then you have to start the retraining again. So he likens it, I think very aptly, to an athlete like a weightlifter trying to train muscle mass. This isn't anything willful. You're just trying to expand the capacity of the brain for working memory. And just like an athlete who exercises, I can build up my biceps. But if I stop exercising for a month, guess what's going to happen? My bicep is going to atrophy now because it's not being exercised as much. And the same is true with these neuropsychological training programs that we have seen so far. Now, Klingberg gets royalties from the company, and we would like to see his research replicated by someone who does not have a financial stake in the success of the company. So it is being tested at 5 universities in the U.S. I know of at least one here in Canada as well. When these studies are over, we're going to have an idea about whether his findings could be replicated. But even if they are replicated, let's not forget what he found. This is a temporary exercising program that has to be reinstituted several times a year to sustain the gains. Now, let me tell you something else. If it turns out that this works, why would you spend several $1,000s when you can buy a Nintendo DSS and the BrainAge software, which does both of these things as well as at least 6 other frontal lobe executive function tasks? It's just as much fun, if not more so. It's 1/10 the cost. So I would direct you to Nintendo before I would say send you to CogMed. And if you don't want to invest the couple $100 that DSS costs with the software, get Scientific American Mind. This is the popular science magazine Scientific American. They also publish one called Scientific American Mind. The last issue of Mind was a review of all internet sites that have executive function training programs on them, where you can go. Some of them are free. Most of them have a monthly fee that you can sign on for. And there's the software, there's the games, there's tracking your successes and failures. All the things that Nintendo and CogMed are doing can be done through these websites without buying the equipment, usually for like $9 or $10 a month. Some are more, some are less. Some are more interesting, some are less interesting. But there's a review of all of these brain training websites in that magazine, and it's very good. By the way, Nintendo comes out looking really good because it's the only portable system you can take anywhere and practice anytime, even if you're waiting in a car for Little League to start. So look around. CogMed isn't the only thing out there. But let's wait for the research to come out before we know whether this is really going to turn out to be a coping tool. And that's all it is. It is not a cure, not by any means. That was probably more information than you ever wanted to hear. Right. Okay. All right, here is the relationship. All right, the relationship between ADHD and bipolar is a one-way street. ADHD children carry no elevated risk for bipolar disorder over that of the general population. No longitudinal studies have found that to be the case, my own included, not the Canadian studies, not the New York studies, not the Iowa, not the Swedish, not the Australian. Risk is 2 to 4%, which is the population rate. So if a child starts out ADHD, that's probably what they're going to stay. Bipolar becomes a very remote diagnosis. However, if there is bipolar disorder in the family, the risk goes up 8 times. Now, the real relationship is from bipolar to ADHD. If a child has bipolar disorder already, and it started in childhood, the risk is 80 to 97% that they will have ADHD along with it. And that is why the confusion. People saw that so many bipolar children had ADHD, they made the leap that the opposite had to be true, that ADHD was a big risk for bipolar, and it turned out to be no risk for bipolar disorder, unless the family history of bipolar illness is there. And then the genetic risks for bipolar disorder, obviously, are what mediate that high risk. So bipolar disorder, only if it starts in childhood, carries a very high risk for ADHD along with it, and ADHD is usually the first disorder to start. If the bipolar starts in adolescence, the risk is 40 to 45% that ADHD is with it. If it starts in adulthood, which is the more typical form of bipolar disorder, the risk is only 20 to 25%. So notice it's the early onset bipolar that brings the risk of ADHD with it, not the other way around. Now, if there's bipolar there and it started in childhood, it is one of the worst psychiatric disorders a child can have, barring infantile autism or schizophrenia. Very difficult to manage. It requires multiple medications to try to deal with it. There is obviously an increased risk of not just destructiveness, but violent behavior, particularly in males. There is periodic hospitalization for safety as well as for re-engineering the psychopharmacology, that is, testing the drugs. Many of the drugs used with bipolar disorder have far more serious side effects than the ADHD drugs do, and so children are often hospitalized partly to monitor the side effects as they're titrating them. The bipolar child has a massive increase in risk for suicide and drug abuse as they enter adolescence. So this is not a fun disorder. But it's 2 to 3% roughly of children have the bipolar disorder, and it is severe, and it is usually lifelong, and it often requires polypharmacy and periodic hospitalization. So the news isn't good. But at least we can say ADHD is not a cause of bipolar disorder. Most ADHD children are never at risk for it. But if there's a family genetic link to bipolar, then that young child with ADHD may also carry that link and that risk. Okay, there are more than 400 studies of the stimulants. There are additional studies of the other drugs like atomoxetine. They're all placebo-controlled. The placebo rate in most studies is between 10 and 35%. The rate of responders to the active medication is between 55 and 92%, averaging to about 75%. So it's twice the placebo rate. So at this point, we can be assured from these randomized placebo-controlled studies that the medication has a real effect, not just an effect of psychological suggestibility, as the placebo effect might suggest. So all I can tell you is those studies have been done, they've been done repeatedly, and we can be assured this is not a placebo effect. It doesn't mean there isn't a little bit of a placebo effect, but most of the effect is clearly that of an active agent.